Hi everybody, Dr. Ahles here. In this short video, we're going to explore the two main kinds of compounds in the human body, how we would classify them, and generally what their functions are. So when we're talking about the types of chemical compounds in the body, we're going to use the words organic versus inorganic. Now, like my picture shows, if we go to the grocery store, there's going to be a whole lot of things that are classified as organic. So we can see in our picture here, oh, I'm USDA organic, or I'm classic organic, or super organic. In the grocery store, there may not be a set definition for what organic means, but in chemistry classes and in biology classes, we do have a set meaning for these terms. So in science, when we use the word organic, we're meaning a compound that contains carbon. So by that definition, then, if something is inorganic, it does not contain carbon. So when we talk about carbon-containing compounds, organic compounds, we're talking about things like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, or nucleic acids. And there'll be videos about each of these organic molecules that you can watch after this one. What this video is going to focus on, though, are the inorganic compounds. So inorganic compounds are things that do not have carbon. When we talk about inorganic or non-carbon compounds, the most important one is water, but we also have a lot of important salts and acid and bases in the body. So let's start with that first inorganic compound, water. Even though it's already in bold, go ahead and underline, highlight, star this. Water is critical to life. It's the most important non-carbon containing molecule in your body. The reason that water is so important, or the kinds of things that it can do, come from the characteristics that make water special. So let's start with the fact that water has a high heat capacity. When I say that water has a high heat capacity, what I mean is that it can absorb a lot of heat. This is really good for you when we're outside in the summer and we need to have our body temperature not change too much. To make your body temperature change, it takes a lot more heat than it would if we weren't filled with so much water. So, high heat capacity. We can stay a relatively constant temperature because the water inside of us can absorb that extra heat. It also has a high heat of vaporization. What that means is when you're sweating, a lot of heat leaves with the water. So as water evaporates from inside of you, it takes a lot of heat with it. Again, really good for temperature balance in your body. Water also does a couple other important functions in our body. So water is a main component of things like cerebrospinal fluid. This is the special fluid that surrounds your brain and your spinal cord. It acts as a cushion to help protect those parts of your body. Water is also critical to hydrolysis reactions. Let's underline, highlight, star, hydrolysis. Remember that in a hydrolysis reaction, we use water to break a chemical bond. Gotta have water to do hydrolysis. When we talk about water, with all of these various characteristics, water is what makes up most of the fluid in your body. It's the most common solvent, meaning we can use it to dissolve things. Now, when water is dissolving things, keep in mind that it is polar. And if you don't remember from biology for majors, polar means that parts of this molecule are positive, parts of it are slightly negative. That's going to help determine the kinds of molecules that can dissolve in it. The kinds of molecules that can dissolve in water are what we call hydrophilic, water-loving. But we also have what are known as hydrophobic molecules in the body. Hydrophobic molecules are molecules that do not like water. They avoid water. Or this end part, phobic, literally means they're afraid of it. So I have a silly cartoon, nerd Dr. Ahles. We've got two molecules of water, and they find this molecule of oil. Oil, by the way, is a hydrophobic molecule. So my first water says, hey, oil, you want to hang out? And oil's like, I can't mix with you guys. And the other water says, hydrophobe, you're just afraid of us because we're water. So hydrophobic molecules are do not enjoy the company of water. Hydrophilic molecules do. As we'll see later, your plasma membrane on your cell has parts that are hydrophilic and parts that are hydrophobic. So this idea will come back and be really important. Water can interact with compounds in a variety of different ways. So when we talk about the way that things are interacting together, the kinds of mixtures we can form, there's 3 different names. So the first kind of mixture we can form with water is what we call a solution. In a solution, whatever is inside that water will completely dissolve. It'll completely fall apart. That's different from things called a colloid. So a good example of a colloid is Jell-O. When we look at the structure of Jell-O, you can see through it, but also it's a little bit cloudy. Light doesn't pass directly through Jell-O just like it would through water. That's because there are things inside of it that are suspended in it. You can't see them, but they cause the light to not pass straight through. It's maybe a little cloudy. We can see colloids either in a liquid state or in a semi-solid state like the Jell-O, or another good example of a semi-solid colloid would be cytosol, the fluid that's inside your cells. The last kind of mixture that we have when we mix things with water is what we call a suspension. In a suspension, it doesn't even look clear. Like, we know there are things that are floating around inside of it. And if we took this vial of blood and we spun it on a centrifuge, we could actually separate out those parts that were suspended, that were being held up in water. So with these types of watery mixtures, if we're talking about a solution, it's completely dissolved. You cannot see what was in there. If we're talking about a colloid, you mostly can't see what's in there, but there are things that are suspended. Whereas in a suspension itself, things will settle out. They're very big. You can see them. 3 different kind of mixtures that we form using water. Moving on from water, that first inorganic compound, let's move into our salts. When we talk about salts, these are examples of what we call an ionic compound. So check it out, not a tricky thing. Ionic compounds are made with ionic bonds. So remember that ionic bonds form between a cation with a positive charge and an anion with a negative charge. So the reason we have cations and anions in the body is because we need electrolytes. Now, you've probably heard about that on a bottle of Powerade, right? Electrolytes. What electrolytes actually do in your body is help to conduct electricity. Best example of this is when we think about the way that neurons function. Neurons change their charge inside versus outside to be able to talk to their neighbors. That's because of the movement of these cations and anions. Some of the most common salts that we see in the body: sodium chloride, also potassium chloride, and calcium phosphate. This salt down here, used to build your bones. Sodium chloride and potassium chloride, used to generate those electrolytes that help us to send messages. The last kind of inorganic compound that we're going to mention today are acids and bases. When we talk about acids and bases, these are also ionic compounds. But when these break down, they function a little bit differently than my salts do. So when we talk about an acid, when this breaks down, what it releases is not sodium, it's not potassium, it's hydrogen ions. Now, hydrogen ions are what we use to determine our pH scale, so how acidic or basic something is. When we have a lot of hydrogen ions, our pH goes very low. A low pH is acidic. What got me to a low pH are acids that break apart and release a hydrogen. We also have bases. When bases dissolve in water, They actually create ions that are able to absorb hydrogen ions. So we take a high amount of hydrogen ions that are making us very acidic, we pull out those hydrogen ions, or conversely, we release some hydroxyls, which will neutralize those hydrogen ions. Both of those things raise the pH. Remember that a high pH is something that's basic. Some of the most common acids and bases that we see in the body: hydrochloric acid and lactic acid up here at the top, and bicarbonate, which is our most common base. So acids and bases, ionic compounds that either release hydrogen or absorb hydrogen. This brings us to the idea of the pH scale. Now, hopefully you've talked about pH in chemistry or in a biology class previously. When we think about normal pH inside the body, it's not actually neutral. It's not actually 7. It's 7.4. Let's underline, highlight, star 7.4. The fact that blood has a pH of 7.4 means that we run a little bit basic. We're on the basic side. But we manage blood pH using that process we've talked about before, homeostasis. So I say that the average pH is 7.4, but we have a little bit of wiggle room within that to make our body still be healthy. We're always going to try to get back to about 7.4, but we can go a little higher or a little lower and not see negative effects. So some of the ways that we maintain that homeostasis in the body: the kidneys and the lungs will either release compounds or bring compounds back into the bloodstream to change the pH actively. We also have things inside the bloodstream called buffers, and the job of buffers is to either absorb hydrogens or absorb hydroxyls, depending on whether we're running basic or acidic. So the inorganic compounds that we talked about, the compounds that do not have hydrogen, we started with water, the most important one in the body. Then we talked about salts that function as electrolytes. And finally, we talked about acids and bases, the things that determine the pH in your body. In the next video, we're going to move on to talking about some of our organic compounds, the ones that do have carbon.